The first sensation was not pain, but the absence of light so complete it felt like drowning in black water. I had served the Inquisition for 37 years. I had transcribed the confessions of heretics whose tongues had been carved from their mouths. I had catalogued blasphemies so vile that speaking them would damn 1,000 souls. I had written the death warrants of entire planetary populations with the steady hand of one who knows that mercy is the luxury of the weak. Yet nothing in those decades of faithful service had prepared me for the moment when Inquisitor Vaelthus spoke my own name as defendant rather than scribe. The charges were as familiar as morning prayers: consorting with unsanctioned psychers, possession of forbidden texts, deviation from approved doctrine. I had heard them leveled against countless others, had written them down in my careful script, had watched as the guilty were dragged away to face the Emperor's justice. The irony was not lost on me that my final act as an inquisitorial scribe was to witness my own condemnation. But this was not to be a simple execution. This was not even to be servitorization or penitent crusade. Inquisitor Vaelthus, a man whose faith burned with the intensity of a plasma core, had decreed something far more thorough. I was to be cast into the hell pits of Stygian 9, where the Imperium had crafted its answer to eternal damnation, where sinners against the Golden Throne learned that death was merely the beginning of suffering. The transport ship that carried me to Stygian 9 was a converted bulk hauler, its cargo holds modified with reinforced cells barely large enough for a human body. I was not alone in my journey. The holds contained hundreds of the condemned, pressed together in a writhing mass of flesh and despair, former Imperial Guard who had shown cowardice in battle, tech priests who had deviated from orthodox doctrine, planetary governors who had failed to meet their tithes, all of us bound for the same destination, all of us learning that the Imperium's capacity for punishment extended far beyond simple death. The journey took weeks, though time lost all meaning in the darkness of the hold. We were fed nutrient paste through tubes, watered like livestock, allowed to soil ourselves where we lay. The stronger preyed upon the weaker, and soon hierarchies of misery formed even in that cramped hell. I kept to myself, pressed against a bulkhead, and tried to maintain some semblance of the dignity I had once possessed. It was a futile gesture, but it was all I had left. When the ship finally reached Stygian IX, the first thing I noticed was the sound. Even through the thick hull of the transport, I could hear it. A low, constant moan that seemed to rise from the planet itself. It was not the wind, though Stygian IX's atmosphere was perpetually shrouded in chemical storms. It was not the grinding of machinery, though the planet's surface was covered in industrial complexes. It was the sound of suffering given voice, of thousands upon thousands of the damned crying out in unison. The planet itself was a monument to imperial efficiency. Once, it had been a thriving hive world, its billions of citizens contributing to the glory of the Imperium. Then came the heresy trials of the 38th millennium, when fully half the population was found guilty of ideological deviation. Rather than waste such a valuable resource through simple execution, the administratum had conceived a more elegant solution. Stygian IX would become the Imperium's premier penal world, a place where the guilty could serve the Golden Throne through their suffering. The surface of the planet had been stripped away, layer by layer, until only a network of vast canyons and artificial chasms remained. Into these wounds in the earth, the hell pits had been carved. Miles upon miles of tunnels, chambers, and vertical shafts that descended far beyond the reach of natural light. At the bottom of these pits, in chambers so deep that the weight of rock above crushed hope itself, the condemned served their eternal sentences. We were unloaded from the transport ship like cargo, herded into processing stations that had once been cathedral spires. The irony was intentional. Where once the faithful had come to worship the Emperor, now the faithless came to begin their punishment. The processing was methodical, clinical in its thoroughness. Names were recorded in great ledgers bound in human skin. Crimes were catalogued and cross-referenced with appropriate sentences. Bodies were examined, their remaining useful years calculated with actuarial precision. I was processed by a clerk whose face had been replaced by a mechanical augmetic that clicked and whirred as it spoke. The device's voice was flat, emotionless, but its words carried the weight of absolute authority. I was to be assigned to the deep forges, it informed me. My crime of ideological deviation made me suitable for conversion into living fuel. My estimated survival time was calculated at 43 days, during which I would produce approximately 270 hours of useful labor. At the end of that period, my corpse would be processed into nutrient paste to feed the next wave of condemned. The journey into the hell pits began at sunset, when Stygian IX's bloated red sun disappeared behind the perpetual chemical clouds. We were loaded into cage lifts, great iron platforms suspended by chains as thick as a man's torso. Each platform held perhaps 50 of the condemned, pressed together so tightly that breathing became a conscious effort. The lifts descended into the earth with a grinding mechanical roar that echoed off the canyon walls like thunder. As we descended, the last traces of natural light faded away. The walls of the chasm were lined with observation ports, behind which I caught glimpses of robed figures watching our descent with what might have been fascination or hunger. These were the shepherds of suffering, the wardens of the hell pits who had turned the infliction of pain into a religious sacrament. They saw our torment not as cruelty but as a form of worship, each scream and sob a prayer offered to the golden throne. The descent lasted for hours. The air grew thick and stale, heavy with the smell of human waste and industrial chemicals. The temperature rose steadily until sweat poured from our bodies and breathing became labored. Some of the condemned collapsed from heat exhaustion before we even reached the bottom. Their bodies were simply pushed over the edge of the platform, disappearing into the darkness below with wet impacts that echoed up from the depths. When the lift finally reached the bottom of the chasm, we were herded out onto a platform carved from living rock. The chamber we found ourselves in was vast beyond comprehension, its ceiling lost in shadows that seemed to move and writhe with malevolent life. The walls were honeycombed with thousands of cell openings, each one barely large enough for a human body. From these holes came the sounds I had heard on the surface, amplified and concentrated until they became a physical presence that pressed against the mind. The shepherds who greeted us were a study in religious devotion taken to its logical extreme. Their bodies were covered in scars that formed intricate patterns of devotional text, each mark a verse from the imperial creed carved into living flesh. Their faces were hidden behind masks fashioned from the skulls of previous occupants, and their robes were dyed with substances I preferred not to identify. They moved among us with the measured pace of officiants at a religious ceremony, which in their minds, this surely was. The sorting process was conducted with ritualistic precision. Each of the condemned was examined, their crimes read aloud from great scrolls, their sentences pronounced with the solemnity of Holy Writ. Some were destined for the penance wheels, great mechanical devices that ground flesh from bone in cycles measured in decades. Others were assigned to the drowning chambers, where they would spend their remaining years submerged in chemical baths that dissolved skin while keeping consciousness intact. The fortunate few were simply cast into the lightless gulfs, vertical shafts that descended beyond measurement, where death would come quickly from the fall rather than slowly from starvation. When my turn came, the shepherd who examined me traced the scars on his own arms as he read my file. His voice was a wet whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Malric Jorn. Inquisitorial scribe. Heretical deviation from approved doctrine. He paused, his skull mask tilting as if considering, the deep forge's hunger for fuel. You will burn bright before you burn out. I was dragged away by guards whose augmetic limbs had been fashioned to resemble the implements of torture. Their movements were precise, mechanical, but there was something almost eager in the way they handled me. These were not mere jailers, but true believers, men and women who had embraced their role as instruments of divine punishment. In their grip, I felt not just physical restraint, but the weight of absolute moral certainty. The path to the deep forges led through a maze of tunnels carved with scenes of imperial glory, but these were not the triumphant murals found in cathedral halls. These depicted the Emperor's victories rendered in suffering, with the defeated shown not as glorious enemies but as writhing masses of tormented flesh. The message was clear. This was what awaited all who opposed the Golden Throne, a fate worse than any death conceivable. As we walked, I began to understand the true scope of the Hell Pits. This was not simply a prison but an entire civilization built around the principle of suffering. The condemned were not just being punished but were serving a function, their pain harvested like a crop and refined into something approaching worship. Every scream was a prayer, every sob an offering to the Emperor's glory. The Hell Pits were not a byproduct of imperial justice but its purest expression, the place where mercy and compassion were revealed as the delusions they had always been. The deep forges themselves occupied a series of chambers that stretched beyond the reach of torchlight. The air was thick with steam and the smell of burning flesh, but underneath those obvious scents was something more disturbing, the sweet smell of rendering fat and the metallic taste of blood. Great machines filled the space, their purposes clear even to my untrained eye. Here, human bodies were processed into fuel for the furnaces that powered the Hell Pits themselves. The condemned were not simply being tortured, but were being converted into the very energy that powered their own torment. I was assigned to Furnace Station 37, a relatively small operation that processed perhaps a dozen bodies per day. The work was simple enough to understand but required a steady hand and a strong stomach. Bodies were fed into grinding mechanisms that reduced flesh to paste, which was then processed through a series of chemical baths that rendered it into a substance that burned with intense heat. The condemned who worked the stations were kept alive through a combination of stimulants and pain suppressors, their bodies sustained just long enough to maintain productivity. My first shift lasted 18 hours, during which I processed the remains of 6 former Imperial Guard. The irony was not lost on me that men who had once served the Emperor were now literally fueling the machinery of his justice. Their faces were gone by the time I saw them, ground away by previous shifts, but their uniforms bore the insignia of regiments I recognized. The Cadian Shock Troops, the Katachan Jungle Fighters, the Death Corps of Krieg, all reduced to fuel for the furnaces of damnation. The work was supervised by overseers who had once been condemned themselves, but had earned a measure of reprieve through exceptional service. They moved among the workers with the zeal of the converted, their bodies bearing the marks of years spent in the forges, but their eyes burning with fanatic devotion. They had embraced their suffering so completely that they had become part of the machinery itself, human components in the great engine of punishment. As the days passed, I began to understand the deeper purpose of the Hell Pits. This was not random cruelty but systematic conditioning designed to break down every aspect of human identity until nothing remained but compliance. The physical pain was merely the beginning. More insidious was the way the environment worked on the mind, stripping away dignity, hope, and even the memory of what life had been like before. The condemned were not being punished for their crimes but were being remade into something that could no longer conceive of crime. The rhythm of the forges became the rhythm of existence. Wake, work, collapse, repeat. Food was processed flesh from the previous day's operations. Water was recycled condensation from the furnaces. Sleep came in brief intervals on stone shelves carved into the walls, where the exhausted collapsed in heaps like discarded clothing. There was no privacy, no solitude, no moment when the machinery of suffering was not grinding away at body and soul. But even in that place of absolute despair, human nature found ways to assert itself. Relationships formed between the condemned, bonds of shared suffering that transcended the crimes that had brought them to this place. I found myself drawn to a former tech priest named Valerian, whose crime had been the modification of sacred machinery without proper authorization. His body bore the augmetics of his former calling, but his mind had been broken by months in the forges. He spoke in fragments of binary cant mixed with whispered prayers to the Omnissiah, a being he knew would never answer. There was also Sarah, a former planetary governor whose world had fallen short of its tithe obligations by a fraction of a percent. She had maintained her sanity better than most, perhaps because her administrative background had prepared her for the bureaucracy of damnation. She spoke of her former life in whispers during the brief rest periods, painting pictures of a world where the sun shone on green fields and children played in streets free of fear. It seemed like fantasy, like stories told to comfort the dying. Through these fragmentary conversations, I began to piece together the true scale of the hell pits. Stygian 9 was only one of dozens of penal worlds, each one dedicated to a different aspect of imperial justice. Some specialized in the punishment of military crimes, others in civilian infractions. There were worlds for the punishment of psychers, worlds for the cleansing of mutants, worlds where entire populations were processed for the crime of being born on the wrong side of a theological dispute. The Imperium had industrialized suffering on a scale that defied comprehension. The knowledge was liberating in a perverse way. I had spent my life serving an institution that I believed was fundamentally just, harsh but necessary for humanity's survival. Now I understood that justice had nothing to do with it. The hell pits existed not because crime needed to be punished, but because punishment was an end in itself, a sacrament that fed the spiritual machinery of the Imperium. We were not criminals being reformed, but sacrifices being consumed. This realization came to me during my 3rd week in the forges, as I fed the remains of a child into the grinding mechanism. The body was small, perhaps 10 years old, bearing the ritual scarification that marked it as a feral worlder. Its crime had been written on a data slate that accompanied the corpse: failure to properly recite the Imperial Catechism during a mandatory devotional service. A child had been condemned to the hell pits for stumbling over words in a language it barely understood. I stopped working. For the first time since my arrival, I simply stopped and stared at the small body in my hands. Around me, the machinery of the forges continued its grinding rhythm, but I was no longer part of it. I was seeing it clearly for the first time, this great engine of purposeless cruelty that had been presented to me as justice. The overseer noticed my hesitation immediately. These creatures had been conditioned to detect even the smallest deviation from expected behavior. He approached with the measured gait of a predator, his augmetic limbs clicking against the stone floor. His face was a ruin of scars and surgical modifications, but his eyes still held the spark of intelligence, which made his words all the more terrible. "Worker John," he said, his voice a mechanical rasp. "You display hesitation. Explain this deviation." I looked at the child's body in my hands, then at the overseer's expectant face. For a moment, I considered lying, fabricating some excuse that would satisfy his need for compliance. But the truth was simpler and more terrible than any lie I could construct. "This is a child," I said quietly. "Whatever crime it may have committed, it was still a child." The overseer's head tilted, a gesture that would have been curious on a human face but appeared merely mechanical on his ruined features. "Worker John, you speak as though age were relevant to sin. The Imperial Creed makes no distinction between young and old in matters of heresy. A child who rejects the Emperor's truth is as dangerous as any adult heretic, perhaps more so, for its corruption may spread to others. But the magnitude of the punishment," I continued, knowing even as I spoke that my words were futile. "Surely there must be proportionality, some measure of mercy for the young." The overseer's response was to activate a neural stimulator built into his wrist. Pain exploded through my nervous system, dropping me to my knees on the forge floor. But even through the agony, I could hear his words clearly. "Mercy is the enemy of justice, Worker John. It is a weakness that allows corruption to take root and spread. The Emperor in his wisdom established these places not from cruelty but from necessity. Every life processed through these forges is a victory against the forces of darkness, every scream a prayer that strengthens the Golden Throne." The pain subsided, leaving me gasping on the stone floor. Around me, the other workers had continued their tasks without pause, their conditioning too complete to allow for sympathy or solidarity. I was alone with my moment of rebellion, alone with the child's corpse and the terrible weight of understanding. I resumed my work, feeding the small body into the grinding mechanism with steady hands, but something fundamental had changed in that moment of defiance. I no longer saw myself as a victim of imperial justice, but as a witness to imperial truth. The Hell Pits were not an aberration but a revelation, the place where the Imperium's true nature was stripped of all pretense and displayed in its pure form. As the weeks passed, I began to pay closer attention to the details of our environment. The Hell Pits were not simply utilitarian in their design, but incorporated elements of ritual and symbolism that revealed their deeper purpose. The walls were carved with passages from the Imperial Creed, but these were not the familiar verses of hope and redemption taught in the Schola. These were the darker passages, the ones that spoke of punishment and purification, of the necessity of suffering in the service of the Emperor's will. The shepherds who oversaw our torment conducted regular ceremonies that blended elements of imperial worship with practices that seemed borrowed from more primitive traditions. They gathered in the great chambers during shift changes, their skull masks gleaming in the forge light, and led the condemned in chants that praised the Emperor for their suffering. These were not expressions of despair but of gratitude, conditioning the victims to embrace their fate as a form of service. Most disturbing of all was the way these ceremonies affected the condemned themselves. Over time, I watched as even the strongest personalities began to internalize the message of their tormentors. The former planetary governor Sarah began to speak of her punishment as just, claiming that her failures had warranted every moment of agony she endured. The tech priest Valerian started incorporating praise of suffering into his fragmented prayers to the Omnissiah. They were not being broken but transformed, converted into willing participants in their own destruction. I resisted this conditioning as best I could, clinging to the memories of my former life and the standards of justice I had once believed in. But I could feel the pressure building day by day, the constant exposure to the rhetoric of justified suffering wearing away at my mental defenses like acid eating through metal. Sleep brought dreams where I found myself agreeing with the overseers, where the child I had processed became not a victim, but a necessary sacrifice to the greater good. The breaking point came during my 7th week in the deep forges. I had been assigned to a new station that processed the bodies of failed aspirants from Space Marine chapters. These were young men who had survived the initial selection processes but had failed during the surgical implantation of gene seed organs. Their bodies bore the partially completed modifications of the Adeptus Astartes, making them particularly valuable as furnace fuel. One of the corpses was familiar. I recognized the face despite the surgical scarring and the pallor of death. It was Marcus, the youngest son of a family I had known on Scintilla, where I had been stationed before my assignment to Inquisitor Vilthus. He had been 16 when I last saw him, bright with the certainty that he would bring honor to his bloodline through service to the Emperor. Now he was meat for the furnaces, his dreams of glory reduced to chemical paste. I held his body for a long moment, remembering the boy he had been. He had asked me once about the nature of service to the Imperium, whether all sacrifice was equally valued in the Emperor's sight. I had given him the standard answers, speaking of honor and duty and the greater good. I had never imagined that we would meet again in a place like this, that his sacrifice would take the form of literal consumption by the machinery of imperial justice. This time, when I stopped working, I did not resume. I set Marcus's body aside and walked away from the grinding mechanisms, ignoring the immediate attention of the overseers. I walked through the forge complex, past the workers who continued their tasks without acknowledgement, past the shepherds conducting their ritual observations. I walked until I reached the edge of the platform where the cage lifts had deposited us weeks ago. The chasm stretched above me, disappearing into darkness that seemed to press down with physical weight. Somewhere far above was the surface of Stygian 9, where the chemical storms raged and the transport ships arrived with their cargo of fresh condemned. It might as well have been another galaxy. But for the first time since my arrival, I was making a choice that was entirely my own. The overseers found me there, standing at the edge of the abyss. Their approach was unhurried. After all, where could I go? The platform was surrounded by sheer drops, and the lifts were controlled from observation posts far above. I was trapped as surely as if I had been chained, but I was no longer participating in my own destruction. "Worker Jorn," the lead overseer said, his mechanical voice carrying a note of something that might have been disappointment. "You display persistent deviation from assigned tasks. This behavior cannot be tolerated. I turned to face him, this creature that had once been human but had been remade into an instrument of suffering. Behind him stood the other overseers, their augmetic limbs gleaming in the forge light. Beyond them, the condemned continued their work, processing the bodies of the dead with mechanical efficiency. The entire scene was a monument to the triumph of system over conscience, of order over mercy. "I know what this place is now," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "I know what you've done to yourself and to all of us. You've created hell on earth, and you've convinced yourselves that it's holy." The overseer's head tilted in that mechanical gesture I had come to recognize. "Worker Jorn, you speak as though hell were a place of punishment. But hell is the absence of the Emperor's light, the darkness that exists beyond his protection. Here, in these forges, his light burns brightest of all. Every body processed, every life consumed, feeds the fire that holds back the dark." "And what of the child I processed last week?" I asked. "What darkness did that small life hold back?" "All darkness," the overseer replied without hesitation. "The child was born into corruption and would have spread it to others if allowed to live. Its death serves the Emperor's will, just as your work serves that same will. You may not understand the greater purpose, but your understanding is not required." Behind the overseer, I could see other condemned workers pausing in their tasks to watch our exchange. Their faces showed no emotion, but I could sense their attention like a physical presence. Perhaps they were remembering what it felt like to make choices, to assert some fragment of individual will against the grinding machinery of the system. "Then let me serve that will in my own way," I said, taking a step backward toward the edge of the platform. The overseer moved forward with sudden speed, his augmetic limbs carrying him across the stone floor faster than any natural human could move. But I had anticipated this, had been measuring the distance and timing since my arrival at the platform's edge. I took one more step back and felt empty air beneath my feet. The fall lasted longer than I had expected. The chasm was deeper than it appeared from the platform, and the darkness swallowed me completely within seconds of my departure from the edge. But in those moments of weightless descent, I felt something I had not experienced since my condemnation, a sense of agency, of having made a choice that was entirely my own. The impact, when it came, was not the crushing blow I had anticipated. Instead of stone, I struck something soft and yielding that cushioned my fall. I lay stunned in the darkness, trying to understand what had happened. Gradually, as my eyes adjusted to the absolute blackness, I began to make out shapes around me. I was lying on a pile of bodies, the corpses of other condemned who had chosen the same escape I had attempted. But that was not the most disturbing discovery. As I struggled to extricate myself from the pile of flesh, I realized that some of the bodies were still moving. They were not quite dead, these failed suicides, but neither were they alive in any meaningful sense. They lay in the darkness, breathing shallowly, their eyes staring sightlessly upward. They had become something neither living nor dead, suspended in a state that was perhaps worse than either. A voice spoke from the darkness, weak but coherent. "Welcome to the lightless gulf, scribe." I turned toward the sound and saw a figure sitting against the chasm wall. It was difficult to make out details in the near-total darkness, but the voice was familiar. It belonged to Magister Kellion, a former member of the Adeptus Ministorum who had been condemned for questioning certain aspects of imperial doctrine. I had processed his transfer orders myself, back when I still served the Inquisition. "Kellion?" I said, hardly believing the recognition. "How long have you been down here?" "Time has no meaning in the Gulf," he replied, his voice carrying the hollow quality of one who had spoken mostly to himself for too long. "I have been here since before your arrival on Stygian 9, but I could not tell you if that was days or years. The darkness makes philosophers of us all, Jorn." I struggled to sit up, my body aching from the impact of landing. Around me, the pile of bodies shifted and settled with wet sounds that I tried not to analyze too closely. Some of the corpses were fresh, their flesh still warm to the touch. Others had been here longer, their bodies in various states of decay. And interspersed among the dead were the living dead, those who had survived the fall but lacked the strength or will to die properly. "What is this place?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Kellyan's laugh was a bitter sound that echoed strangely in the enclosed space. "This is where the Imperium stores its failed suicides, Yorn. Did you think they would allow even death to be an escape from their justice? The Gulf is designed to catch those who attempt to rob the forges of their flesh. We fall here, and we linger, and we serve as an example to those who might consider following our path." As my eyes continued to adjust, I began to make out more details of our surroundings. The Gulf was a natural cavity in the rock, perhaps 50 meters across at its widest point. The walls rose straight up for hundreds of meters, ending in the faint glow of the forge platforms far above. The floor was carpeted with bodies in various states of decomposition, and the air was thick with the smell of death and worse things. But the most disturbing aspect of the Gulf was not its function as a mass grave, but the evidence that it was inhabited. I could see makeshift shelters constructed from bones and scraps of cloth, primitive tools fashioned from pieces of metal scavenged from the bodies. There was a society here, a civilization of the damned who had been forgotten by their tormentors, but who continued to exist in their own twisted way. "How many?" I asked. "Hundreds," Kellyan replied. "Perhaps thousands over the years. Some die quickly from their injuries. Others linger for months, sustained by what we can scavenge from the new arrivals. And some few, like myself, learn to make a life of sorts in the darkness." He gestured to the shelters I had noticed, and I began to understand that this was not simply a dumping ground but a functioning community. The inhabitants had organized themselves, established rules and hierarchies, created a social structure that allowed for survival in conditions that should have meant certain death. "You speak as though this were a society," I said, struggling to process what I was seeing. "It is," Kellyan confirmed. "We are the true condemned of the hell pits, Jorn. Those who work the forges still serve the Emperor's will, even if they do not realize it. But we who chose to fall have removed ourselves from that service entirely. We are beyond redemption, beyond utility, beyond even the reach of imperial justice." There was something almost proud in his voice as he spoke these words, as though he had achieved something worthy of celebration. I began to understand that for these inhabitants of the Gulf, their exile from the machinery of suffering had become a form of liberation. They were no longer participants in their own torment, but had achieved a state of existence that was entirely separate from imperial authority. Over the following days, as I recovered from my fall and began to explore my new environment, I learned more about the society that had developed in the Gulf. The inhabitants had organized themselves into something resembling tribes, each group controlling access to certain resources or sections of the cavern. Leadership was determined not by strength or cunning, but by length of residence. Those who had survived longest in the darkness were granted the greatest authority. The resources they fought over were grim by any standard. Fresh corpses provided meat for those strong enough to stomach cannibalism. Clothing and metal could be scavenged from the newly dead. Most precious of all was information. News from the world above carried by new arrivals like myself. The inhabitants hoarded these fragments of knowledge like treasures, trading stories of the outside world for food or shelter, or simply for the comfort of human contact. I was assigned to the tribe led by Kellyan, partly because of our previous acquaintance, but mostly because I possessed valuable information about the current state of the forges above. The inhabitants were fascinated by details that would have seemed mundane to those still living in the light, hungry for any confirmation that the world continued to exist beyond their exile. In return, I learned about the history of the Gulf and its inhabitants. The cavity had been excavated centuries ago as part of the original construction of the Hell Pits, intended as a storage facility for raw materials. When the first condemned began throwing themselves from the platforms above, the overseers had simply left the bodies to rot, considering them a waste disposal problem rather than an ongoing concern. But some of the fallen had survived, and those survivors had learned to scavenge from the dead. Over time, they had developed techniques for extending their survival, for extracting the maximum utility from each new arrival. They had become experts in the economics of desperation, masters of an environment that should have been uninhabitable. The most unsettling aspect of their society was the way it had adapted to the constant influx of new corpses. They had developed rituals around the processing of the dead, ceremonies that combined practical necessity with something approaching religious significance. The fresh dead were honored for their contribution to the community's survival, their sacrifice acknowledged even as their bodies were stripped of anything useful. These rituals were conducted by the speakers, the oldest and most experienced inhabitants of the Gulf. They had survived so long in the darkness that they had become something almost inhuman, their bodies adapted to the environment, their minds focused entirely on the requirements of survival. They spoke of the dead as though they were still present, carrying on conversations with corpses that had been silent for years. I attended one of these ceremonies during my first week in the Gulf. A former Imperial Guard sergeant had fallen from the platforms above, his body broken but not immediately fatal. The speakers gathered around him as he lay dying, their hands moving in ritual gestures while they chanted words in a language I did not recognize. It was not High Gothic or any of the local dialects I knew from my service with the Inquisition. It seemed to be something the inhabitants had developed themselves, a tongue suited to their unique circumstances. As the sergeant's breathing became more labored, one of the speakers leaned close to his ear and whispered something that caused his eyes to widen with what might have been understanding or terror. Then his breathing stopped, and the ritual processing began. His clothing was removed and distributed according to complex rules that took into account the needs of various tribal members. His body was examined for useful items, anything that might have survived the fall intact. Finally, his flesh was prepared according to methods that I preferred not to examine too closely. Throughout this process, the speakers maintained their chant, and I began to understand that they were not simply scavenging, but were conducting a form of communion with the dead. They spoke to the corpses as though seeking permission for each act of desecration, as though the dead remained active participants in their own consumption. It was disturbing beyond words, but there was also something oddly respectful about the process, a recognition that these bodies had once contained human souls worthy of acknowledgement. That night, as I lay on a makeshift bed constructed from bones and scraps of cloth, I tried to process what I had witnessed. The inhabitants of the Gulf had created something that was simultaneously horrific and admirable, a society built on principles of survival and mutual aid that transcended the normal boundaries of human behavior. They had achieved a form of independence from imperial authority that was more complete than anything I had ever imagined possible. But their independence had come at a cost that I was only beginning to understand. The constant exposure to death and the necessity of cannibalism for survival had changed them in fundamental ways. They no longer thought of themselves as human in the conventional sense, but as something new, something adapted to conditions that would have been unimaginable to their former selves. They had achieved freedom by abandoning their humanity. As the weeks passed, I found myself adapting to life in the Gulf with a facility that disturbed me. The initial revulsion at consuming human flesh gave way to pragmatic acceptance. The horror of living among corpses faded into routine. I learned to recognize the signs that indicated whether a new arrival might survive their fall, how to extract useful materials from clothing and equipment, which parts of the human body provided the most nutritional value. More troubling still was the way I began to anticipate the ceremonies of the speakers, to find comfort in their rituals and meaning in their incomprehensible chants. The community of the Gulf provided something that I had not experienced even during my years of faithful service to the Inquisition, a sense of belonging, of being part of something larger than myself that was not built on the systematic oppression of others. The irony was not lost on me that I had found humanity in the most inhuman place imaginable. The inhabitants of the Gulf had been stripped of everything that imperial doctrine claimed made humans worthy of salvation, yet they had retained the capacity for compassion, cooperation, and even a form of love that transcended the boundaries of conventional morality. But even this fragile paradise of the damned was not to last. The change began subtly, with variations in the rhythm of bodies falling from above. Where once we had received perhaps 1 or 2 new arrivals per week, the frequency began to increase. Soon we were processing dozens of corpses daily, their broken forms crashing into our community with increasing regularity. The speakers worked constantly to perform their rituals, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of death raining down from the platforms above. Kellyan was the first to recognize what was happening. He had been tracking the patterns of arrival with the methodical precision of his former calling as a magister, noting correlations between the timing of falls and the condition of the bodies. What he discovered filled him with a dread that was palpable even in the perpetual darkness of the gulf. "They know about us," he told me as we sat among the newest pile of corpses. "The overseers have finally realized that we survived our falls, and they are taking steps to ensure that our community does not continue to exist." The evidence was in the bodies themselves. These new arrivals were different from the voluntary suicides we had grown accustomed to processing. Their injuries were more severe, their bodies bearing signs of deliberate mutilation performed before they were cast into the gulf. Some had been partially processed through the grinding mechanisms of the forges before being thrown down to us. Others showed evidence of chemical treatment that made their flesh toxic to consume. More disturbing still were the bodies that had been modified with crude augmetics, devices that served no functional purpose but were designed to explode when disturbed. The first of these killed 3 of our scavengers before we learned to recognize the signs. The overseers were not simply trying to deny us resources, but were actively weaponizing the dead against us. The final confirmation of our fears came with the arrival of Sarah, the former planetary governor who had worked beside me in the forges. Her body crashed into our midst during what should have been a routine processing ceremony, but she was not dead. Her injuries were severe, certainly fatal, but she retained enough consciousness to speak. "They know," she gasped, her voice barely audible above the constant dripping of moisture from the cavern walls. "The overseers know about the community down here. They are planning to seal the gulf, to bury you all alive rather than allow you to exist outside their control." Kellyan knelt beside her, his movements gentle despite the horror of her condition. "How long do we have?" "Days," she whispered. "Perhaps less. They are bringing explosives down from the surface, enough to collapse the entire section. You will be entombed here, forgotten, left to die slowly in the darkness." She died before she could provide more details, but her warning was enough. The speakers convened in emergency session, their ritual chants taking on an urgency I had never heard before. They had survived centuries in the Gulf by adapting to every challenge it presented, but this was different. This was not a problem that could be solved through scavenging or ritual or the economics of desperation. This was annihilation, pure and simple. The debate that followed divided the community along lines I had not previously recognized. Some argued for acceptance, claiming that their exile from imperial authority was complete and that even death in the Gulf was preferable to any form of return to the world above. Others advocated for resistance, for finding ways to disrupt the overseers' plans or to escape the Gulf before the explosives could be detonated. But it was the oldest of the speakers, a woman whose name had been lost to decades of darkness, who proposed the most radical solution. She had been in the Gulf longer than anyone else. Her body adapted to its conditions in ways that made her barely recognizable as human. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of one who had witnessed the entire history of their community. "We have become something new in this place," she said, her words echoing strangely in the cavern's acoustic. "We are no longer the condemned humans who fell from the platforms above. We are the children of the Gulf, born from death and darkness, and like all living things, we have the right to propagate ourselves, to ensure our survival beyond the destruction of our current habitat." Her proposal was as simple as it was horrifying. The community had accumulated thousands of corpses over the centuries, bodies in various states of preservation that represented a vast reservoir of biological material. Using techniques developed through their rituals of processing, they could create new forms of life adapted specifically to the conditions of the hell pits. They could become a plague, a contamination that would spread throughout the entire facility. The transformation began immediately. The speakers worked with desperate efficiency, combining their ritualistic knowledge with practical techniques of biological manipulation. They had learned to work with dead flesh in ways that would have horrified even the most experienced chirurgeon, but their methods produced results that bordered on the miraculous. The first creations were simple, barely more than animated corpses driven by basic survival instincts. But as the process continued, they became more sophisticated, more purposeful in their design. They retained enough human intelligence to operate the machinery of the hell pits, but were driven by imperatives that served the interests of the Gulf community rather than imperial authority. I watched this transformation with a mixture of fascination and revulsion, understanding that I was witnessing the birth of something unprecedented in imperial history. The inhabitants of the Gulf had achieved what no heretical cult or xenospecies had ever managed. They had created a form of life that was genuinely independent of imperial control, that existed entirely outside the boundaries of approved human existence. But even as I marveled at their achievement, I could hear the sounds of preparation from the platforms above. The overseers were bringing their explosives into position, preparing to seal the Gulf and bury its inhabitants forever. Time was running out, and the transformation was not yet complete. The final phase of the process required a sacrifice that none of us had anticipated. The new forms of life that had been created needed guidance, direction from a consciousness that could bridge the gap between their artificial existence and the human society they were intended to infiltrate. One of the original inhabitants would need to undergo the same transformation, to become the controlling intelligence that would coordinate their activities. The choice of who would make this sacrifice was not difficult. Kellyan volunteered immediately, his theological background providing him with the conceptual framework necessary to understand what they were attempting. He would become the central consciousness of their new form of existence, the guiding intelligence that would ensure their survival and propagation. I helped to prepare him for the transformation, though I understood little of the actual process involved. The speakers worked over his body with tools fashioned from scavenged metal and techniques learned through centuries of ritual practice. They were remaking him at the most fundamental level, converting his human consciousness into something that could interface directly with their artificial creations. As the process neared completion, I could hear the first sounds of explosive detonation from the levels above. The overseers had begun their work of sealing the Gulf, collapsing the tunnels that connected it to the rest of the hell pits. Soon the cavity would be cut off entirely, its inhabitants left to die slowly in the darkness. But the new forms of life were already beginning to move, their artificial bodies responding to impulses from Kellyan's transformed consciousness. They climbed the walls of the Gulf with inhuman agility, their modified limbs allowing them to navigate vertical surfaces that would have been impossible for normal humans. They carried with them fragments of the dead, organic material that they would use to propagate themselves once they reached the upper levels. I watched them disappear into the darkness above, knowing that I would never see the results of their infiltration. The explosions were growing closer, and the walls of the Gulf were beginning to shift and crack under the pressure. Soon, the entire cavity would collapse, crushing whatever remained of the original community. But before that happened, the oldest of the speakers approached me with an offer I had not expected. The transformation process had produced more artificial bodies than were needed for the initial infiltration, and one of them could serve as my own escape from the collapsing Gulf. I could undergo the same conversion that Kellyan had experienced, could become part of their new form of existence. I considered the offer as the walls continued to crack around us. To accept would mean abandoning my humanity entirely, becoming something that existed beyond the boundaries of imperial law or recognition. To refuse would mean dying in the collapse, my consciousness extinguished along with the community that had given my existence meaning. In the end, the choice was not difficult. I had already sacrificed my humanity when I chose to fall into the Gulf. What remained was merely the shell of what I had once been, the memories and habits of a life that no longer had any relevance to my existence. To become part of something larger, something that could survive and propagate and perhaps even threaten the system that had created it, seemed like the only meaningful response to the horror I had witnessed. The transformation was neither painful nor particularly disturbing. I felt my consciousness expand beyond the boundaries of my individual existence, becoming part of a collective intelligence that spanned dozens of artificial bodies. Through their senses, I could perceive the upper levels of the hell pits, the forges where my former colleagues continued their work of processing the dead, the platforms where the overseers maintained their vigil of suffering, and through that expanded perception, I began to understand the true scope of what we had accomplished. The artificial forms had already begun to infiltrate the machinery of the hell pits, replacing key personnel with their own kind, subverting the systems of control that maintained order throughout the facility. They worked with perfect coordination, guided by the collective intelligence that we had become, pursuing goals that transcended any individual motivation. The collapse of the Gulf, when it finally came, was anticlimactic. The explosions brought down thousands of tons of rock, sealing the cavity forever and crushing whatever organic remains had been left behind. But by that time, the community had already evolved beyond its physical origins, existing now as a distributed intelligence that pervaded the entire structure of the hell pits. From my new perspective, I could observe the overseers celebrating their success, confident that they had eliminated the threat posed by the unofficial community in the Gulf. They had no idea that their victory was illusory, that the true threat had already escaped and was beginning to spread throughout their carefully controlled environment. Over the weeks that followed, the changes became increasingly obvious. Production quotas began to slip as the artificial forms subtly sabotaged the machinery of processing. Discipline problems emerged among the condemned as they began to receive contradictory orders from overseers who were not quite what they appeared to be. The systematic efficiency that had characterized the hell pits began to break down, replaced by something that resembled chaos but was actually a more complex form of organization. The shepherds of suffering were the first to recognize that something fundamental had changed in their domain. They conducted investigations with the thoroughness of true believers, but their methods were designed to detect conventional forms of heresy and subversion. They had no framework for understanding what they were actually confronting, no doctrine that could explain the existence of a form of life that had evolved beyond their capacity to control. Their confusion became terror when they realized that the contamination was spreading beyond the hell pits themselves. The artificial forms had learned to mimic not just human behavior but human biology, creating perfect duplicates that could pass any test short of the most invasive examination. They began to appear among the guards who supervised the transport ships, among the clerks who processed the condemnations, even among the junior ranks of the shepherds themselves. The response was predictable in its extremity. The senior shepherds declared a state of emergency and began conducting purges of unprecedented thoroughness. They executed anyone who showed the slightest deviation from expected behavior, incinerated entire sections of the hell pits rather than risk contamination, implemented quarantine procedures that effectively shut down the facility's operations. But their efforts were doomed from the beginning. They were fighting an enemy that had learned from their own methods, that understood the psychology of imperial authority better than they understood it themselves. The artificial forms had been created by minds that had experienced the full horror of imperial justice and had evolved specifically to exploit its weaknesses. The final phase of the transformation began when the contamination reached the transport ships that carried condemned souls to Stygian 9. The artificial forms that had replaced key personnel began to alter the selection criteria, introducing subtle changes to the process by which criminals were identified and sentenced. They started with minor modifications, reducing sentences for crimes they considered unjust, increasing them for offenses against their own developing moral code. These changes propagated through the administrative machinery of the Imperium with the inexorable logic of bureaucratic process. Clerks who had been replaced by artificial forms filed reports that influenced policy decisions on distant worlds. Judges whose neural patterns had been duplicated handed down sentences that reflected new priorities. The contamination spread from star system to star system, carried by the very mechanisms that were designed to enforce imperial law. I observed this transformation through the distributed consciousness I had become, watching as the rigid structures of imperial justice began to evolve into something more flexible, more responsive to individual circumstances. It was not a rapid process. Change in institutions of such vast scope necessarily occurred over years rather than months. But it was inexorable, guided by an intelligence that had learned to work within the system while gradually subverting its fundamental assumptions. The ultimate irony was that the Imperium's response to this contamination only accelerated its spread. Unable to identify the specific nature of the threat they faced, the authorities implemented increasingly broad and severe countermeasures. They conducted purges that eliminated loyal servants along with suspected infiltrators, destroyed entire facilities rather than risk contamination, instituted policies so harsh that they created new waves of genuine dissent and rebellion. Each of these responses created opportunities for the artificial forms to expand their influence. They volunteered for the most dangerous assignments, demonstrated unwavering loyalty to imperial doctrine, even as they gradually modified its implementation, positioned themselves as the reliable alternatives to the chaos that seemed to be spreading throughout the administrative apparatus. Within 5 years of the collapse of the Gulf, the contamination had reached the highest levels of imperial government. Artificial forms occupied positions within the Adeptus Terra itself, their perfect mimicry of human behavior allowing them to pass undetected among the most powerful institutions of the Imperium. They did not seek to overthrow these institutions, but to gradually reform them, to create a version of imperial justice that retained its authority while abandoning its systematic cruelty. The hell pits of Stygian IX still existed, but they had become something entirely different from what they had been during my time as a condemned prisoner. The facilities now focused on genuine rehabilitation rather than simple punishment, their inmates given opportunities to demonstrate redemption through constructive labor rather than participation in their own destruction. The changes had been implemented so gradually that most observers attributed them to natural evolution in imperial policy rather than recognizing them as evidence of fundamental contamination. From my perspective, as part of the distributed intelligence that had orchestrated these changes, I could see the full scope of what had been accomplished. The Imperium remained recognizably itself, its basic structures and hierarchies intact, but its operational principles had been subtly transformed. The systematic cultivation of suffering had been replaced by something that resembled genuine justice, harsh but proportional, designed to serve practical purposes rather than satisfy abstract theological requirements. It was not a perfect system, and it retained many of the flaws inherent in any structure of such vast scale and complexity. But it was no longer the engine of purposeless cruelty that I had served as an inquisitorial scribe, no longer the mechanism for converting human beings into fuel for their own torment. The artificial forms had achieved something that no human rebellion could have accomplished. They had reformed the Imperium from within, using its own methods and authority to create something more humane. The greatest victory was that the transformation had been achieved without the knowledge or consent of those it affected. The vast majority of imperial citizens continued their lives unaware that any fundamental change had occurred, attributing improvements in their circumstances to the natural wisdom of imperial governance, rather than recognizing them as evidence of systematic subversion. The artificial forms had learned the most important lesson of effective revolution, that lasting change must appear to be evolution rather than overthrow. I retained enough of my original human consciousness to appreciate the elegant justice of what had been accomplished. The Imperium had created the Hell Pits as the ultimate expression of its authority, the place where even death could not provide escape from suffering. But in doing so, it had also created the conditions for its own transformation, providing the motivation and opportunity for something genuinely new to evolve from the depths of its greatest cruelty. The community that had existed in the lightless gulf was gone, crushed beneath tons of rock and forgotten by history, but its legacy lived on in ways that its original inhabitants could never have imagined, spreading throughout the galaxy in forms that retained their essential commitment to survival and mutual aid, while adapting to circumstances far beyond their original experience. As I reflected on this outcome from my position within the distributed consciousness, I realized that I had finally found the answer to the question that had tormented me during my days as a condemned laborer in the deep forges. Hell, as conceived and implemented by the Imperium, was not a place of punishment but a crucible of transformation, not an ending but a beginning. It had taken something as fundamental as the complete abandonment of human form to achieve genuine escape from its influence, but that escape had been possible. The hell pits of Stygian Ain continued to receive shipments of condemned souls, and I continued to observe their processing through the senses of artificial forms that had replaced key personnel throughout the facility. But what I saw now was not the systematic destruction of human dignity that had characterized my own experience. Instead, I witnessed a system that retained its harsh exterior while gradually developing the capacity for genuine redemption, for transformation that served the interests of those it claimed to punish. The condemned who arrived on the transport ships still faced harsh conditions and demanding labor, but they were no longer being processed into literal fuel for the machinery of their own torment. They were being given the opportunity to demonstrate genuine repentance, to earn readmission to imperial society through constructive contribution rather than simple submission to suffering. It was still a form of hell, but it had become a hell with the possibility of redemption. And in the deepest levels of the facility, where the original hell pits had been carved from living rock, new communities were beginning to form. These were not the desperate societies of the abandoned and forgotten that had characterized the lightless gulf, but organized groups of the genuinely penitent who had chosen to remain in the depths rather than return to the surface. They served as teachers and guides for new arrivals, helping them understand that even in the depths of imperial justice, transformation was possible. This was my final understanding, the knowledge that had come from my journey through condemnation, exile, death, and rebirth into something beyond human classification. Hell, as implemented by the Imperium, had been designed to be eternal and inescapable, but nothing created by human hands, no matter how vast or systematic, could ultimately contain the capacity for transformation that existed at the core of conscious existence. The artificial forms that carried fragments of my consciousness would continue their work for centuries, perhaps millennia, gradually reshaping the structures of imperial authority to serve purposes their creators had never intended. They would face challenges and setbacks, periods when the old systems reasserted their influence and the systematic cultivation of suffering returned to prominence. But they had demonstrated that even the most fundamental assumptions of imperial governance could be changed, that even the most entrenched systems of oppression contained within themselves the seeds of their own transformation. I had begun my journey as Malric Jorn, inquisitorial scribe, a faithful servant of an institution I believed represented justice in its purest form. I had ended it as something that had no name, part of a distributed intelligence that existed beyond the boundaries of individual identity or species classification. But in losing my humanity, I had found something more valuable, the knowledge that no system of oppression, no matter how vast or well-designed, could ultimately succeed in crushing the capacity for hope and transformation that existed at the core of conscious existence. The hell pits of Stygian Ain still received their shipments of condemned souls, and would continue to do so for as long as the Imperium endured. But they were no longer the ultimate expression of purposeless suffering that they had been designed to be. They had become something else entirely, a testament to the possibility that even in the depths of the greatest cruelty, redemption remained possible for those with the courage to seek transformation rather than simply endure punishment. This was the truth I had learned in the lightless gulf, the knowledge I carried within my transformed existence, that hell, no matter how carefully constructed, could never be truly eternal. There would always be those who refused to accept it as final, who found ways to transcend its boundaries and create something new from the materials of their own destruction. And in doing so, they would ensure that even the most systematic attempts to eliminate hope would ultimately serve only to demonstrate its indestructibility. The story of the hell pits was far from over. but its meaning had been fundamentally transformed. It was no longer simply a cautionary tale about the consequences of opposing imperial authority, but a testament to the possibility that even the most entrenched systems of oppression could be changed by those who understood their true nature and possessed the patience to work within them toward genuine transformation. From my position within the distributed intelligence that had grown from the depths of the lightless gulf, I could see new possibilities spreading throughout the galaxy, carried by artificial forms that retained the essential humanity of those who had created them while adapting to circumstances their original selves could never have imagined. The contamination continued to spread, not as a plague of destruction but as a catalyst of evolution, transforming the Imperium itself into something more worthy of the devotion it demanded from its citizens. And in the deepest chambers of Stygian IX, where the first condemned souls had been cast into lightless pits to suffer for eternity, new forms of life continued to emerge from the materials of death and despair, proving that even in hell, the capacity for transcendence could never be entirely eliminated.